You're listening to Blackpool Church Podcast. Join us for our Sunday gatherings to make friends, explore faith and encounter God. Visit our website, blackpool.church. This is the Talk Archive.
Today, I'm going to be talking about the patience problem. Now, let's be honest, patience is something that sounds great on paper, but when it comes to practice, it's a bit of a nightmare. Now, I feel like our culture is constantly living at like 100 mile an hour. Everybody's whizzing round and you get kind of irritated by the smallest of delays. Now, in our house, it might look like Netflix starts the buffer, and I mean like for 5 seconds, and I'm frantically pressing the back button on the remote, like, come on, what's going on? And another one is at Lidl, where they never seem to have enough people on the checkouts. And it's my turn at the queue, I'm at the front, the people behind me, it's not their turn, but I start to sweat because like the cashier's just throwing food at me, and I'm like, oh, I can't get this packed quick enough. And our culture is kind of just addicted to the right now. Instant results, instant responses, and instant relief. So yeah, the patience problem is real. And most of us are pretty deep in it. But there's a bit of a twist. As followers of Jesus, we start to see that God uses waiting. That delays don't always lead to dead ends. They're shaping tools. They form something deeper inside us. And in this series where we're looking in the book of Exodus for Jesus in the Old Testament, because Exodus is full of lessons about impatience, patience, and how God handles the both. Now, impatience isn't just about getting a bit moody when things don't go our own way. It runs a bit deeper than that. For most of us, the stuff that we might have been waiting on, it could be a job that hasn't opened up, a breakthrough that's just not happening. Prayers that we've been praying for months and sometimes even years, and it feels like nothing's changing. And when that waiting begins to drag on, we get a bit restless, and we start asking ourselves in our heads, as like, God actually heard me? Am I doing something wrong? And before you know it, you're not just feeling impatient anymore. You're feeling a bit let down or forgotten. That's when the real stuff starts to come to the surface. The frustration, the urge to just go and sort it out yourself. The slow slide into bitterness or hopelessness. And underneath all of it, if we're being honest, it's a bit of a trust issue. Now, waiting forces us to face the parts of us that still want to be in control. The bits that struggle to believe that God's timing is better than our own. Now, I once remember overhearing somebody say that I was much more patient before I had kids. And I was like, what's this guy going on about? I didn't have kids at the time, so I was a bit judgy. But I was like, the children didn't make you impatient. Like, just expose something that was already on the inside. And that's what waiting does. It stretches us and shows us what we've been hiding all along. And I've seen it kind of more times than I'd like to admit in myself. The danger is when we don't deal with that stuff, it pulls us away from God. We run to distractions and we settle for less. We make decisions out of panic or fear and not faith. And it doesn't look like outright rebellion, but it is still us saying, I'm not sure I can wait for you anymore, God. And I wish I could stand here and say that I've got patience nailed, but I haven't. Like, I've never been naturally patient. Just ask my wife, Alex. Now, I'm going to tell you a story where I once tried to teach Alex to drive. And we'd been through many lessons, and we'd spent like a small fortune on these lessons, and it just felt like we weren't getting anywhere. And so I'm sure, like many husbands and fathers in this room, I thought, I'm a pretty good driver. And I thought, I'll help her out. So we got some insurance on the car, and I thought, boost the confidence and we'll get the pass quicker. Now, I remember we'd been to our friend Tom's house in St Anne's, and it was me, Alex, and my friend Luke, and on our way home, Alex said, I'd like to drive. So I said, yeah, of course you can. So we all nervously got in the car, we got the L plates on, and we set off, and round the back streets of St Anne's, like, it was a really good, solid drive. She was calm, patient, and really good. And then we hit like a key decision point in the journey. We could either go down the prom or the back roads. Now, I suggested the prom. It's a nice, long, straight, simple journey back to our house. But Alex really wanted to try Queensway, which is a fast, bendy, 40-mile-an-hour road. It's not really ideal for a learner, not without an instructor anyway, but I didn't want to crush her confidence, so I said yeah. And so as we pulled onto the road, she started to panic, foot fully on the accelerator, and it was just an absolute chaos. The car started drifting into the other lane. There was oncoming cars. And I remember looking in the mirror and I saw Luke's face just like frozen in fear. And that's when I started to shout. I was saying, Alex, you need to steer the car. You need to steer the car. And already overwhelmed, Alex shouted back to me, Jack, I am steering. We pulled up at the traffic lights at the end and we swapped seats. I drove the rest of the way home. And Alex was so quiet. I knew I'd upset her. I'd knocked her confidence. And it wasn't because she'd done really badly wrong, but it's because I couldn't hold my own nerve. My impatience, my fear, and my need to control the moment shut her down. Now, it didn't hit me till later. I wasn't just impatient. I was untrusting. I didn't give her space to learn. I didn't leave room for weakness or mistake. I wanted all the results without the process that goes with it. And growth doesn't work like that. Not in driving and not in discipleship. Sometimes what people need from us is not a quick fix. It's patience. And when we lack it, we can end up damaging what God is building in someone else. That's what makes happens in Exodus so serious. Israel's impatience didn't just lead them to make a bad choice. It reveals something deeper. They weren't just tired of waiting, they stopped trusting. They gave up on the process and in doing so, turned to something else entirely. So far, we've looked at how impatience might show up in our lives, but this isn't just a modern problem. God's people have always struggled with this, and in fact, as I was reading through Exodus, I came to the realization that the Israelites might be the most impatient people in the whole Bible. And before we judge them, we've got to realize their story was written down to help us see ourselves more clearly. Now, Paul literally goes on to say in 1 Corinthians that these stories were written down for our instruction, so we don't make the same mistakes. Exodus isn't just their story, it's ours. And it shows us something powerful. Yes, the people are impatient and forgetful, but God, He's steady, He's patient, He's full of mercy. And even when they begin to grumble, He provides. Even when they rebel, He corrects them with compassion. He doesn't give up on them just like He doesn't give up on us. So over the next few minutes or so, we're going to look at 3 key stories from Exodus. 3 moments where their impatience flared up and God showed them who He really is. And in each of these, we'll see something even deeper than that, because hidden in these stories is a picture of Jesus. He's there even in the Old Testament, and He's the one who shows us what real patience looks like. So the first bit in Exodus I'd like us to look at is the crossing of the Red Sea in chapter 14. Now, this is a huge turning point. Israel's finally free from slavery in Egypt. Now, they're on the move, running away from Pharaoh, and at the last minute, Pharaoh changes his mind. He sends his entire army after them. So now the people are standing with the Red Sea in front of them, like nothing but sea. And when they look over the shoulder behind them on a cliff, it's the Egyptian army. And they just absolutely terrified. They full on lose it, go into full panic mode. And they start shouting at Moses, "Why did you bring us here to die? We were better off in Egypt." Now, they've seen at this point, they've seen God do miracle after miracle. And now, days later, they're ready to give up because fear has completely taken over. This is what impatience looks like when it's driven by fear. They couldn't see a way forward, so they just assumed that God had failed them. And when we get scared, we do the same thing. We'd rather rush into a bad option or even go backwards than sit in the space where we have to wait and trust. And if we look at what Moses says in that moment, he doesn't stand up and give them a big, long motivational speech or a big, long-winded plan. He simply says, "Don't be afraid. Stand still. The Lord will fight for you. You only need to be silent." That's hard. Everything in them wanted to run, to fix it, to escape. And Moses is saying, no, stop, trust, and wait. And then God moves. His presence comes between Israel and the Egyptian army, protecting them. He tells Moses to stretch out his staff, and the sea starts parting. The wind blows all night long, and by morning there's a dry path straight through the sea. Israel walks across, and as soon as they're safe, the water crashes back down and wipes out the Egyptians. Now, the Israelites had just witnessed a huge miracle. They didn't have to fight. They didn't have to run. They just had to walk forward on the path that God had made. And that's the message here, is that God saves and not us. And this moment in the Red Sea, it's a picture of what God does for us through Jesus. The Bible says that we were trapped too. Not by Pharaoh, but by sin and death. And just like the Israelites, we couldn't fix it. We couldn't save ourselves, but Jesus made a way. Not through the sea, but through the cross. He has fought the battle. He's paid the price. He has already made the path. We just have to step into it. And even when some of the Israelites were full of faith and others were absolutely terrified, they were all saved the same once they stepped onto the path. Because their safety didn't depend on how strong their faith was. It depended on who their faith was in. And that's the good news, because sometimes our faith feels strong and other times it's hanging by a thread. But Jesus is strong, and if we're trusting, he carries us. So what does this story teach us about patience? It shows us how fear can drive us to panic. When we're afraid, we want quick fixes, but sometimes God says, be still and let me work. Secondly, it shows us how patient God is with us. The Israelites are complaining constantly, they're shouting, they're blaming, and God still comes through. He doesn't wait for them to get their act together. He saves them anyway. That's how Jesus is with us. He doesn't give up on us when we're scared or struggling. He stays, he acts, and he saves. So maybe you're facing something today that feels like a Red Sea moment, trapped, no good options left to take, tempted to take things into your own hands. But maybe what God's saying to you is the same thing he said back then. Stand still and let me fight for you. Now, you don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to be strong, but you do have to trust the one who is. Now, you'd think after walking through the Red Sea with walls of water either side and watching the Egyptian army get wiped out, the Israelites might chill out a bit. But no. Fast forward just a few days and the moaning again. We're hungry, we're thirsty. Why did you bring us here to die, Moses? Now, Exodus 15-17 shows this pattern clearly. God had just rescued them in the most mind-blowing way. But at the first sign of discomfort, they start to panic. At Marah, they found water, but it was bitter, so God miraculously made it sweet. Problem solved. But not long after, it's about food. And suddenly, Egypt, with its slavery and beatings, is sounding better than freedom. At least we had meat and bread back there, they say. That's impatience speaking. That's what happens when fear and hunger start rewriting the past. They remembered Egypt's food, but forgot its chains. Sometimes we fall into the same trap when we're waiting for a breakthrough. It might be financial, emotional, spiritual. It's really easy to romanticize our old life. Even if it was broken, at least it was predictable. At least we were comfortable in our dysfunction. But God responds with grace. He literally rains bread from heaven, manna. It appeared every morning with the dew, enough for one day at a time. But they weren't allowed to hoard it, and if they tried, it rotted. God was teaching them to trust him daily. Not weekly, not when it was convenient, but every single day. And there's a rhythm in that, a deliberate slowing down. God was rewiring their hearts to move from panic to patience. And it's a picture of how we're meant to live now. Give us this day our daily bread. Not next month's breakthrough, not tomorrow's answers, just today's grace. And if we try to rush ahead, we miss the point. Like the Israelites, some of us gather more than we need. God also built in the Sabbath. He told them to gather a double portion the day before and rest. But again, some went out on the seventh day and found nothing. And that's the human heart. We can't even rest without feeling like we're missing out. But rest is trust. Stillness is faith. God was saying, stop. I've got you. Trust me. Now here's where it gets even more powerful. The whole manna situation wasn't just about bread. It was pointing towards Jesus. 1,000 years later, Jesus fed a crowd with bread and then said, I am the bread of life. He was basically saying, I'm the real bread. I'm the only one who can fill you and keep you going every day. Jesus is our daily bread. Then in Exodus 17, we see the same again. This time it's about water. They're thirsty, but instead of praying or remembering what God has done for them so far, they accuse Moses yet again. Did you bring us here to kill us, they say. And at one point it gets so heated that Moses thinks that they might stone him to death. Can you imagine that? These people have seen oceans part and now they're about to throw rocks because they're thirsty. And yet again, God responds with mercy. He tells Moses to pick up a rock and strike it, and water gushes out. But listen to this. God says, I will stand before you on the rock. And that's not just a line to throw away. It's God saying, I'm taking the hit. And that's another foreshadowing of Jesus. Paul later says in 1 Corinthians that the rock was Christ. In other words, Jesus was symbolically struck so that living water could flow to us. The cross is that rock. Jesus stood in our place, took the blow that we deserved, and now streams of grace flow from him. And every blessing we have, every drop of spiritual water, is because he was struck. And it wasn't just about water. It was about presence. God was with them, even in their complaining, even in their doubting. He didn't walk away. He stood there, present and patient. So often what we think we need is a quick fix, but what we actually need is God himself. His presence is the real provision. And if we've got him, we can get through anything. But there's also a warning. Exodus 17 isn't just a feel-good story. The Israelites eventually pushed God too far again and again, and that generation miss out on the promised land. They harden their hearts instead of softening them, and the New Testament says, don't be like them. Don't test God with your constant complaining. His patience is deep, but it's not something to abuse. So the question for us is, are we trusting him daily? Or are we grumbling and testing him? Are we waiting on his timing or demanding he moves on ours? If you're waiting right now on healing, on provision, on a job, on answers, ask yourself, am I letting this season bring me towards Jesus, or is it just pushing me further away from him? The good news is that God hasn't brought you this far to leave you behind. He's still standing on the rock, still offering his presence, and he's patient. So don't rush ahead or fall back into the old ways. Meet him in the middle of the wilderness and trust that he knows what he's doing. And now we come to the golden calf incident in Exodus 32, a moment where Israel's impatience explodes into all-out rebellion. Moses is up on the mountain receiving the 10 Commandments and instructions for a covenant that would define God's relationship with all his people. The Israelites are already breaking it at the bottom of the hill. Now, if we rewind a bit to Exodus 24, Moses goes up Mount Sinai and God's presence covers it in fire and cloud. Now, this is probably like visually epic and a bit terrifying, like they can literally see his presence on the cloud. But then days start to roll into weeks, 40 days in total, and the people grow restless again. And they say to Aaron, who's Moses' brother, make us gods who will go before us. That directly translates to, we're tired of waiting. The silence is uncomfortable. Moses has been gone too long. He's probably dead, so let's fix it ourselves. So eventually Aaron caves in. He collects their gold and all their jewelry and earrings, and he melts it down and fashions this golden calf. And then comes the shocking line. These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. Now the audacity of that. They're crediting their salvation to this statue that they've just made minutes ago. And Aaron tries to soften it by declaring a festival to Yahweh the next day. But the damage is already done. They've tried to repackage the living God into a controllable, convenient idol. And it's not just the abandonment of God. They didn't abandon him. It's the rebranding of him. And that's what impatience does. It reshapes God into something that works on our terms. And sometimes we do the same, and it's not with molten gold or earrings or things like that, but with control. When God feels slow or silent, we try to build our own solutions. We sometimes call it wisdom, stewardship, sometimes even put a spiritual label on it. But underneath, it's often just not us wanting to wait, not wanting to trust. Meanwhile, up on the mountain, God sees all this, and he tells Moses, your people whom you brought out of Egypt have corrupted themselves. It's like God is disowning them. He's rightly furious, and he says to Moses, stand back, I'll wipe them out and start again with you. From a justice standpoint, he could. They've broken the first 2 commandments before Moses even made it down the mountain. But Moses doesn't accept the offer. Instead, he pleads with God to show mercy. He appeals not to their worthiness because there is none, but to God's own promises and reputation. What will the Egyptians say? Remember your covenant. And somehow this heartfelt intercession moves God to relent. And it's not because Moses somehow managed to twist God's arm, not because this was because it was always the heart of God to show mercy through a mediator. And it's an echo of the gospel. One man stepping in for a sinful people, pointing ahead to Jesus. Now Moses comes down the mountain and he sees all this chaos, and it's worse than he could ever imagine. And he smashes the tablets. This is a symbol of the covenant being broken. And he takes the idol and he grinds it into powder and scatters it on water and makes the people drink it. And it's bitter. And then comes a hard moment of judgment. The Levites rally to Moses' side and around 3,000 people die. And that feels really harsh, and it is. But it's also a picture of the weight of sin. God is merciful, but sin still carries consequences. And then we get one of the most moving scenes in the whole of Scripture. Moses goes back to God and says, forgive their sin, but if not, blot me out of your book. He's not just interceding now, he's offering himself. Take me instead. And while God doesn't accept the offer, because only a perfect mediator can bear that weight, it foreshadows the one who would. Jesus wouldn't just offer, he would take our place. He'd be blotted out, forsaken, so we could be brought in. In Exodus 33, the fallout continues. God says, you can still have the promised land, but I'm not coming with you. And that breaks Moses' heart. He says, if your presence doesn't go with us, don't send us. In other words, we'd rather stay in the wilderness with you than go anywhere without you. That's the heart of someone who's walked with God's presence over promise, relationship over reward. God hears that prayer and responds, my presence will go with you and I will give you rest. Rest. That's the thing that impatience steals from us. We rush, we strive, we stress, but God says, I'll give you rest. That's what's on offer when we stop trying to control the outcomes and trust him instead. Then in Exodus 34, the story comes full circle. God says, cut new tablets. We're doing this again. He renews the covenant, he starts fresh, and in that moment he reveals his name, not just a label, but his character. The Lord, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. And that's who he is. Even in the wake of betrayal, he is patient, he's merciful, and he's willing to begin again. He also says, yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. So how can both be true? How can God be both just and merciful? The answer is the cross. At the cross, justice and mercy collide. Jesus takes the punishment and we get the pardon. That's how God stays true to both parts of his character. He doesn't ignore sin. He deals with it in full through Jesus. The golden calf story is one of Israel's lowest points, but it's also one of God's most beautiful revelations. We see his justice, but even more his grace, his patience, and his refusal to give up on his people. He disciplines, but he doesn't discard. He judges, but he also restores. Maybe some of us have had golden calf moments. We might have grown tired of waiting or taken stuff into our own hands and ended up in a mess. The good news is that God still writes new tablets, and through Jesus, he still restores covenant. He still goes with us, his presence, his rest, his patience. It's not too late to come back. It's never too late for a fresh start with God. So what do we do with Exodus? Well, first we take a long, honest look at our own golden calves, the things that we turn to when we're sick of waiting on God. It might not be a statue made from melted earrings, but it's often just as foolish. We might take matters into our own hands thinking we're being proactive when really we're just being impatient. That might look like manipulation. It might look like escape through things like entertainment, food, drink, drugs, pornography. It might be that we just lean into our own strength, relying on talent or hustle to fast forward God's plan. These are modern idols, crafted not from gold, but from control. And like Israel, we need to grind them to powder, bring them before God and say, I'm sorry I rushed. I'm sorry I tried to do this my way. I lay this down. Teach me to wait again. Second, I want you to lean hard on Jesus because he's your mediator. When Moses stood between the people and God's wrath, he was pointing ahead to what Jesus would do for us perfectly. 1 John chapter 2 says we have an advocate, Jesus Christ the righteous. He intercedes, he pleads our case, so when you mess up, and you will, don't hide in shame. Don't write yourself off because Jesus hasn't. He's standing in the gap saying, I've already paid for that. Restore them, keep going. That doesn't excuse sin, not at all, but it means grace is always greater. You're not trying to earn your way back. Jesus has already opened the way, so just step into it. Third, treasure God's presence above everything. Moses didn't want the promised land without God. If you don't go with us, we're not going. And God said, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. That's the gift, not just provision, but presence. And if you've got that, you've got everything. Exodus 34 shows us what kind of God he is: compassionate, slow to anger, full of steadfast love. This is a God worth waiting for, a God who is worth trusting in the silence. The more you fix your heart on who he is, the self-description he gave us in Exodus 34, the less room and patience has to grow within us. Finally, take sin seriously, but grace even more seriously. Exodus is full of warnings. Impatience led to idolatry, then chaos, then judgment. And God didn't sweep it all under the rug. There were consequences. And yet, he renewed the covenant. He wrote on new tablets. He didn't walk away. That's grace. Maybe you've got a bit impatient. You've got tired of waiting and took a detour. Hear this. It's not too late. Jesus has made a way back. Grace isn't just about forgiveness. It's about restoration. God can still use you, still walk with you, still write his law on your heart. So all the way through what we've just looked at, there's been this pattern. God's patient, we're not, and it's uncomfortable because it's not just their story, it's ours. Israel moaned about food, panicked when things took too long, and forgot what God had done minutes after he'd done them. But through it all, God doesn't give up on them. He stays, he keeps providing, and it all points forward to Jesus.